Oklahoma is the land of second chances. Who were the people that made it so? We'll dig for the golden threads they've woven through Oklahoma history. The Red River Institute is proud to present Oklahoma Gold. I'm Gwin Faulconer-Lippert, along with award-winning author and Southern Nazarene University historian John J. Dwyer. We'll find the golden nuggets of Oklahoma history here now. Oklahoma Gold. The greatest land run in history. That's today's Oklahoma Gold. John J. Dwyer, tell me a story.
Gwin, most of us, even here in Oklahoma, land of the land runs, where we've heard of what we usually think of as the land run. Well, did you know that there were actually multiple land runs in Oklahoma? That's a surprise to most of us. I'm sure they taught that to me in my ninth grade Oklahoma history class. I probably wasn't paying attention. I'm sure it was my fault, not the teachers. But it was later in life before I realized that there were multiple land runs. Of course, this was the way in which the United States government, and I would say now after about 20 years of study, specifically in Oklahoma history, was a far from perfect, but I would suggest well-intentioned way of allowing, in our case, Oklahoma, 70,000 square miles of land to be shared with many more people than were on it. Of course, it remains and will always remain a controversial deal that the tribes that were forced away from their previous homelands to come here then were divested of that with allotments and reservations and so forth. But I think it's also important to remember that at the time of the land run, 70,000 square miles of land were populated with about 80,000 people. That's a little bit over one person per square mile. By comparison, the state of New York at the time was only two-thirds the size of Oklahoma, had nearly 5 million people. So immigrants were pouring into America from across the world by the millions. The government was trying to balance its commitments to the natives with allowing millions of people to find homeland and build the country across, from sea to shining sea. As I said, it was an imperfect solution, a controversial one, but also, as we see now, the state of Oklahoma was built and has largely grown because of the land runs and the people that were able to come in. For instance, you went from that 80 to 85,000 people. Within 20 years, there were nearly 2 million people in Oklahoma. One of the greatest population expansions in American history. Well, a big way that was accomplished was with the land runs, where the lands where there were still tribal peoples on those, they were paid for their lands. They were given land allotments for themselves in various ways, and then the lands were opened up for all comers initially through multiple land runs to hook up the team, to saddle up the horse, and to get out there and ride for it. That's why you've heard me say before that Oklahoma began as a land of a bunch of tough, poor people. So it was an uphill battle for us in a lot of ways from the start. We didn't have all the rich aristocrats that came here. This was tough land. It was land you had to go out and ride and sometimes fight for. You had to hold on to it through fights, through the weather conditions that we all, even in this modern time, know are not matched probably by anywhere on earth. You have the coldest, most bitter blizzard weather. You have the hottest temperatures. You have the most powerful tornadoes in recorded history. So that's what faced these people that set out. There was initially the land run in 1889, the unassigned lands, which was where you and I are now, Oklahoma City, kind of the central part of the state. Towns like Norman, Stillwater, Kingfisher, Guthrie, later ones like Edmond, Mustang, and more. Then you had runs in 1891 and 92 and 95 before they were so wild and crazy. You had those pesky lawbreakers, the Sooners, that would come in. I know our OSU fans like to pick on us. They say, some things never change. You guys are still winning unfairly or whatever. But the Sooners back then were those, of course, that went in and got land before the shotgun went off. But it did get so crazy that the later land openings, late 1890s, early 1900s, were lotteries. They were things where names would be drawn out of a hopper and so forth. But of course, I left out a minute ago the biggest of all, the big boy, the big daddy of world land runs, 1893, the Cherokee Outlet Run, across northern Oklahoma, towns we know now like Enid, Ponca City, Woodward, Blackwell, Wacomas, where I live now. Those were towns that emanated from this great sweeping run that had over 100,000 people came in from Kansas, from Texas. They rode in on trains from the east, from different directions. And it was just an incredible event. And you had people riding bicycles. You had people with their mule teams. You had people, one of the previous land runs, the Cheyenne-Arapaho run, that was the year before 1892, 3.5 million acres of western Oklahoma, in that case, much of which was not actually even claimed. You had a couple of very creative folks sailed out over the Cheyenne-Arapaho country and claimed their territory, landing from a hot air balloon.
A hot air balloon?
A hot air balloon, yeah.
I got stuck on riding a bicycle across the prairie. I can't imagine a hot air balloon.
Well, I guess that's probably a good place to do it. Western Oklahoma, it would blow you pretty far out there. But to kind of bring this a little closer to home for some folks, this event, if you've ever seen the movie Far and Away, Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman kind of in their heyday as a couple and as actor and actress, Ron Howard, a great Oklahoma luminary from my hometown. He was born in Duncan. He was the director of that film. And Far and Away, just on a wonderful epic scope, told the story of Irish immigrants that came over, as did all of Ron Howard's grandparents. In fact, interestingly, even though the movie Far and Away has a happier ending, I won't spoil it too much for you, but Ron Howard, all four of his grandparents rode in the land run of '93. None of them got land. Okay, this was tough, and even if you got land, you might wind up having a court battle. Many cases of folks that disputed, in particular, some of the town lots. So you had great sweeps of land across northern and northwest Oklahoma in the Cherokee Outlet Run that would be settled by farmers and ranchers. But then you had town plots, that grew into these towns like Enid and Woodward and Ponca City, that people would be sometimes legally, sometimes violently vying for town lots inside these soon-to-grow towns.
Are land runs unique to Oklahoma?
As far as I know, they are. I think there are cases where lands have been opened, but in fact, this is something we can encourage our listeners. Our website, we've got a page where you can actually send in your questions, or if you've got an answer to a question that Dwyer doesn't, like that one, if you know of a land run somewhere besides Oklahoma, John J. Dwyer, that's middle initial J, John J. Dwyer, DWYER.com. Go there and tell us what you know about it.
Now that's Oklahoma gold. The golden thread when we return. The Cherokee Outlet Land Run of 1893 is Oklahoma gold. John J. Dwyer, historian and author, what is the golden thread that stitches the past to Oklahoma's present?
Well, I'll tell you, Gwin, as we look back on what we talked about a few minutes ago, was the greatest of land runs, but of multiple land runs. There was not just one land run that opened up Oklahoma. There were multiple land runs and then multiple allotments of land, lotteries, and so forth. But the Cherokee Outlet Run of 1893, for those that want to know more about it, there's many great books. couple of movies. We talked about Far and Away by Oklahoma native director of Duncan Ron Howard, which starred Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman. Also the first ever Best Picture in the Academy Awards, the first Oscar for Best Picture, a film called Cimarron in 1931 that was the story of the Cherokee Outlet Run. It was remade in 1960 with an actor, Glenn Ford, many of us remember. That came from the epic novel by Edna Ferber. A lot of people recognize her from the novel Giant, with the great film with Elizabeth Taylor and Rock Hudson and James Dean. Well, Giant was kind of in a lot of ways, the origin story and the heart story of Texas. Unvarnished. All the bark off, and that's what Edna Ferber wrote in Cimarron, was the origin story in many ways, at least of modern Oklahoma. So what a lot of folks, in fact, most of us don't realize is that not only was this a tough enough thing to do, you had to come from somewhere where you didn't have much money. Most of the people that the pioneers were involved in these land runs were coming here because it had something they couldn't get anywhere else, free land. But it might have been free monetarily, but it wasn't free to go out and get it in the elements, to ride against thousands of people when there wasn't enough land plots out there for near everybody.
So there was no guarantee you would get any land?
No guarantee at all. It wasn't like you would show up and get in a queue. You had to go out and ride for it. We'll talk about that a little bit more on the Golden Thread. But the context, Gwin, the historical context, 1893 was one of the scariest economic periods of American history. That's a little bit of a semi-golden thread for us to today. 2020, when we're doing this show, is a time of, in fairness, unprecedented economic events and uncertainty. So again, you young people, don't feel like, don't be ashamed to be nervous and confused. Us older folks, we haven't seen anything like 2020 either. Well, 1893, they had a thing called the Panic of 1893. Some historians call it a horrible recession, some call it an outright depression. But it was a national economic downturn of great proportion. In particular, farm prices, agricultural prices had plummeted. So you had a lot of bankrupted farmers from other places that came here to try to make a go of it. And in particular, across the South, by then, a lot of the deep South states, they had farmed their lands out. They had worn them out. So we talk about in Volume 1 of our book, The Oklahomans, how Oklahoma is the land of the second chance, the third chance, and sometimes in the case of these 1893 land run folks, for many people, the last chance they would ever have. And of course, I guess to kind of move into our golden thread, we think of it as, oh wow, these people rode out and bravely, and they all got their land, and they built their homes, and they built their towns. I'm reminded of a Bible verse from the book of Hebrews that says, "And then there were others." And of course, in the Hebrews Hall of Fame, it talks about the people that were not famous that suffered for their Christian faith. Well, we could say there were others. There were many others, Gwin, that rode in these land runs, that sacrificed what they had. In the Cherokee Outlet Run, 100,000 people roughly rode. Maybe a little over 15,000 people were all that got land, no matter how hard they tried. Now, part of the problem was those pesky Sooners we talked about earlier. Those were part of those 15,000. Sometimes they rode out and took some of the best parcels of land. That's why they went to lotteries after that. Many of the people that got the land, they realized this land was not tenable for anything other than, I don't know, buffalo or cattle to graze on. Now we see in the current day the difficulty of towns surviving in western Oklahoma.
That's pure Oklahoma gold.